Welcome to Beyond the Barrel, the podcast where we discuss philosophy from a layperson's perspective, armed only with more questions than answers. Thank you so much for joining us. In today's episode, we talk about what a good life is. We hope you enjoy the show today. What is a good life? Is it a life that you're satisfied with every day, or a life that you're satisfied with when you look back on the end of your life?
Or is it getting rich and having lots of fun and enjoying every moment as it comes to you?
Truly, there's lots of joy to be had, but is a joyful life a good life? Today we're talking about what makes a good life. So Morgan, in your research that you've so dutifully conducted this week, what is a good life?
Well, the research came back inconclusive. Time will show that philosophers at the end of the day have more questions than they do answers.
Generally.
Yeah. But there's so many different ways to think about what a good life is and, you know, how you want to live it and everything that goes along with it.
And so, what got us on this path of discussing what a good life is and what it looks like?
Well, I mean, our last episode was about the good place, and I mean, that the whole premise of that show is basically about like how do you live a life that is going to like basically grant you access to the good place to be qualified as a good person, to have a life well lived. And I mean, it's also kind of just like the original philosophical question, right?
Mhm. Because everybody wants to have a good life, but is having a good life and being a good person the same thing? Are the two things intertwined, so to speak?
It really messes with my mind thinking about that question, like honestly, because I don't know, I feel like there is some possibility in I don't have like any definitive example, but like I feel like there could be a person who doesn't live a good life but is a good person, right?
Mhm. And vice versa?
Maybe is it possible to what's the vice versa of that? The to
To have a good life and not be a good person.
Yeah, yeah. Like basically just to be faking it, right? I mean, I guess
Mhm.
that's possible.
Or I mean, I guess I was speaking in a more self-serving sense.
Mm. See, that's why it messes with my mind. It's so hard to think about it.
Because you're a good person. No, I suppose I in regards to in keeping with the good place metaphor, it's very possible that people who are in the good or who go to the bad place had a very enjoyable life.
Mhm.
So, if we're trying to define what a good life is, and it's a hard task because it
Mhm.
changes across, individuals as well as cultures, as well as maybe even age ranges.
Yeah, and just over time, even within the same
Mhm.
cultures and other demographics.
Mhm. But we have to talk about how to have a good life. We have to have a somewhat close definition of what a good life is, because successful, fulfilling, and moral are not necessarily the same thing.
Right, for sure. Honestly, happy and successful aren't even the same thing, because like there's like all
Mhm.
those self-help books and stuff that are like, how to live your happiest life, how to be your best self. And so what are they basing it off of? What does best self mean?
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
what are we prioritizing in life that makes it good?
Yeah, and that is especially a difficult question in late stage capitalism when I mean, growing up, we are well versed in the idea that we will be happier and more fulfilled if we buy something, even if it's buying self-help books that make us feel happier and fulfilled.
Yeah, I mean, they fill the void pretty well, actually, you know? All those impulsive Amazon purchases.
They do. They do, and that's a problem. Um, anyway, um, God, so yeah, our priorities definitely influence the quality of our lives, I think, because I mean, I think everyone who has experienced setbacks when their priorities are out of order. I think that's a pretty universal experience.
Yeah, for sure. It'll mess up your life whenever your priorities aren't lined up, because it's, like,
Mhm.
really obvious to you when you're living, like, "Oh, man, I'm, like, all out of whack with my priorities. I'm spending so much time," just for example, like, at work and, like, not enough time with my family,
Mhm.
and you really do feel out of whack, and it feels like a bad life. You're like, "This is not what I want for myself. This is not what my family wants for me. This is not how I'm best, a part of my community," or whatever part of life you wanna be most involved in, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, and if you don't make those changes accordingly and make those hard decisions, those tend to be made for you. And then you slip further into feeling like you have a bad life because you've lost what was originally important to you.
Yeah, and I think that's also the way you said that is also kind of having control over our life is probably also another, because we have control over our priorities, but there are certain other things that we don't have control of in our life. Like I don't control whether I'm born to a poor or wealthy family, but each of those things kind of affects how my life turns out.
Mhm.
But are they mutually exclusive to each other, like being a good life?
Mhm.
Like, can
Exactly, right.
either one be a good life or yeah.
Yeah, and I would argue that yes, you can have a good life regardless of what class you were born into and live in.
Yeah, or
S
race or culture or time period or, what career you choose for yourself.
So if it doesn't come down to monetary wealth, then that fulfillingness and that successfulness and or that morality, however we're choosing to define it here, is plays a much bigger role in that quality of life concept.
Mhm.
How pertinent do you think that is over monetary, in a society such as ours, though?
Like, just the idea of, like, if you are born into a wealthy family or a poor one?
Yeah, the idea that you could still have a good life if you are of or live a good life if you are of a lower class and face more monetary issues.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, I think it's relevant to how your life starts out, but ultimately, I don't think it affects the choices you make as an individual. Well, gosh, because it kind of does sometimes, doesn't it?
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah,
Right? So, if
it's
it comes
tough.
down to choices, is a good life a moral life?
Mm,
Does acting morally lead to happiness and fulfillment? I mean, if especially if you believe in things like karmic energy and the rule of 3, in the sense that whatever kind of energy you put out will be returned to you.
mhm. Well, I mean, even too, when you were saying that, I was thinking like altruism as well. Like
Mhm.
people say, helping others and being a part of your community is its own reward. But on the other hand, I can also imagine someone who is like just the most self-centered and like doesn't really take anyone else into consideration, just like prioritizing their own pleasure
Mhm.
when they're making their choices and going through life thinking that they have it made.
Mhm.
So do they? Is it possible that someone can make selfish decisions and, as long as they feel like they're living a good life, right? No, put aside how they're affecting other people around them. If they feel, yeah, I make the decision. Oh my gosh, I'm stuttering so much. I make the decisions I make.
Mhm.
I get what I want in these situations. I don't really care how it affects everybody else. I have an awesome life. I'm a rock star, you know? Does that count
Mhm.
as a good life? Just because they feel like it's a good life?
I mean, if you feel fulfilled, I imagine that if you I think it also comes down to the amount of pleasure versus pain you experience, right? Because if you are living a quote unquote good life in which you're not speaking or acting with regard for others, it's I think it depends on if you feel any internal or external consequences from that, right? Like if
Mm,
you are a lonely person because you act selfishly and your actions push other people away, and you experience a painful degree of loneliness from this, then I think that does detract from the goodness of your life. So I think it comes down to that balance of pleasure versus pain.
yeah. Well, but what happens to the people who act recklessly and never encounter any consequences?
Do you mean like karmically? Cosmically?
Yeah, yeah.
I
'Cause, like, they're not gonna learn that, you know, life becomes miserable, right? What if karma just skips this person, you know?
Are you asking me the ways of the universe?
Oh, I should
'Cause
know
I can't
better.
answer that.
I
All I
know.
can do is refer to good old philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. But, yeah, I think do I think?
Are you?
I'm almost wondering at this point if my brain is still working.
Are you am?
Am I? Am I am?
Well, I mean, we were kind of also in that vein talking about the good life versus the successful life in that sense, and I think what you're talking about there, someone who gets whatever they want and does whatever they want without any consequences, that's a successful life, but it's not necessarily a good life.
Right, not necessarily, but could it be?
I think any life has the potential to be a good life
Even if
because
it causes harm to other people? Because that's kind of where I was going with that is, like,
Mhm,
you know, someone stepping on everybody else, causing, you know, all this harm as they're climbing the ladder of success, you know?
mhm,
Can we still say just because that person's life is good, but maybe they've really hurt the lives of other people around them, does the sum of the goodness of the lives matter? Or, I mean, is the individual life affected by any of that? There's like a whole calculus with this kind of stuff, and I can barely wrap my head around it.
mhm. Yeah, because my instinct is to kind of stick along with the, well, it depends on how if and how they face the consequences of that. But you're right, it's very likely that they won't. And in that sense, does it still remain a good life? Is I guess that begs the broader question of, is a good life something is it judged on an individual level or on a broader level?
Yeah, that's a really good point as well.
Because I think on a broader level that no, that wouldn't be a good life because it wasn't a good life for the community, for the many, for the collective. But on an
Mhm.
individual level, it's very possible that it was.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one, because I think yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Well, because 'cause we're also kind of talking about so we're weighing the individual against the community as well when we're talking about a good life, and it's kind of like, do I do what I want or do I do what's good for everyone? It kind of implies that there might be some kind of duty to the people around you, right?
Mhm.
What you owe other people, to take that from the good place, you know? What do we owe
Mhm.
each other versus what do we owe ourselves, right?
Mhm.
'Cause we
Mhm.
obviously don't wanna go too far with anything like I don't know, just any kind of community involvement, because 'cause you're gonna overextend yourself and then wear away at your own self-worth, and, you know, you do have to take care of your own self and do what's right for you to a certain extent, regardless of how it affects others.
Mhm.
But we also have I think, a duty to each other to prioritize ourselves respectfully, you know?
Yeah. So a good life is a balanced life.
Ooh, I like that. That's catchy. I certainly find that in my own experience. Like, I'm constantly trying to find, like, if there's anything in my life that feels off kilter, you got to find a balance, you know?
Mhm. But it's easier said than done because you are constantly being thrown these curveballs, right? Like pleasure versus pain, right? Like sometimes we get so caught up in our own just day to day suffering in our problems, however big or small, that the idea of a good life almost seems laughable. So, how do you identify where you're off kilter there and how do you get back in that balance?
I mean, I guess I can really just speak from my own experience, but I mean, it's just a feeling, of like unhappiness. So, I don't know, maybe it means that happiness has a really big part in determining the goodness of our lives,
Mhm. Right. Because though a happy life isn't necessarily a good life, as we've established, it does play a role in it.
for sure. And as we're kind of like stacking these ideas, it's reminding me of this word. It's like a Greek word, eudaimonia. It's something that Aristotle talks about a lot, and it's how he kind of defines a good life himself. And it basically translates into English as flourishing.
Mm,
Eudaimonia is flourishing, but there's a little bit more nuance to it in the original Greek. It entails kind of some of the things that we've talked about, prioritizing your own pleasure. But, we're talking about Aristotle as well. So it's going to be balanced. You're going to find that golden mean with it. It
mhm.
has, we're talking about duties to civilization, how to be a good, um, oh my God. How to be a good citizen, how to
Mhm.
be a good friend. I mean, Aristotle talks about all of these things, and he kind of says that all of those things kind of stack up and lead to that eudaimonia. And now, he also talks about how a slave can live a good life as a slave, their duties as slaves. And we can forget about the specifics of Aristotle. We can throw away everything except for the concept of eudaimonia and how do we fill our lives with the flourishing, right? It's like all these layers.
Mhm. Mhm. And that, while a more satisfactory answer than I think we've come with so far, also leads me with much more questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Mostly, if you're talking about your duties and your sense of morality and your sense of being a good citizen, we're talking about inherently subjective ideas. So
Mhm.
where do these ideas of goodness and fulfillment of duty come from? And are they universally definable?
I think, the easy answer to say, like, where do we get these ideas of, what is a good life from or how to be a good citizen, etc. I think all of that comes from just whatever society and culture we're born into to a certain extent, right?
Mhm.
Like, we don't get born into like a blank slate life where we get to figure this all out for ourselves. We get told a lot of things, growing up, and it becomes a part of our own ideologies about, what we want to prioritize in our lives.
Mhm.
As an American, I'm told that I should prioritize having a really successful career in order to have a fulfilling and successful life. I should prioritize family. I should prioritize, any number of things. But is that going to be exactly the same from culture to culture and across time? No, it's not.
And will those things for you on an individual level lead to a fulfilling and ultimately good life?
Exactly, because like, the culture can say one thing about, like, "Oh, you should do this, you shouldn't do that," but what does it mean to you as the individual? Great question.
Mhm. Because of course in our own microcosms of even our towns and our families, that definition kind of gets smaller and smaller. and becomes far less universally applicable and muddies the waters of our own happiness, fulfillment, and pursuit of a good life. So, how do we seek clarity in that? Do we I mean, is this why we turn to religion? Are we looking for absolute, moral codes? Is that why we look to I don't know, like stuff like philosophy for a better indicator of what life can be or what we should pursue?
Yeah, yeah. Great questions. It all has me thinking, like, that's kind of why people go on their own search for meaning in their own life, right? Because they might not be happy with what society says a good life is, and they look to the church, they look to the innocence of children, they look to nature, they look to philosophy, they look to science and try to find their own ideas and their own meaning in life. I don't know where I was going with that. I think that was the end of
No.
that thought, but yeah.
No, you're good. Do you wanna talk I mean, like, do you where do you turn for that if you wanna mind talking about it?
Ooh, where do I turn to for meaning and purpose?
Yeah, or pursuit of a good life. What does that caveat look like for you where you are at now?
Hold on. Am I talking about where I get my meaning and purpose or where what's the question?
That's a gr what avenues do you pursue for to achieve a good life or a
Oh,
fulfilling life?
yeah, sure. Like, I mean, personally, I would feel really distraught if I wasn't, cultivating relationships with people and trying to put good out into the world, like helping other people and bringing comfort into the world and also just enjoying being human, right? Like taking little moments for myself of just noticing a breeze that is particularly crisp or just really enjoying every morsel of food that I eat. I
Mm.
look to little things a lot when I'm trying to cultivate like happiness and fulfillment in my life is I mean, yeah, really just paying attention to the little things is a big thing for me. What
Yeah,
about you? I'm curious what you have to say about yours.
I think for me, when I think in, like, the broader scope of my life, it's always kind of in where I wanna end up, where I wanna look back from, I
Mm,
think, and maybe less day-to-day good life, though that is important too, because you have to get through or not even necessarily get through, but you have to take part in the individual day to day to build that greater reality that you'll look back on. And it's also, like you said, your avenue for enjoyment and just appreciation of life and the things that make us human. But I think for me, in pursuit of happiness and fulfillment and a good life, I have to think there has to be creation in there. I can't think of a version I cannot imagine a version of myself that is not engaged in some sort of project or process. And I think for me, that fulfillment comes from the act of creation and completing a creation, as well as the joy I get from cultivating, relationships that are important to me and have a strong positive influence on me.
yeah.
I think that's what those 2 elements and I have to steal from you once more and say nature, because I think that in this discussion of having a good life as a human or even just a resident of Earth, you have to appreciate all of the amazing things that are around you.
And I mean, hey, I agree with you too. I mean, having goals is also important. Like, it is
Mhm.
important to live in the present and appreciate what you have as part of cultivating happiness and fulfillment in your life. But yeah, if you don't have goals, you're going to end up at the end of your life and you might think, like, well, yeah, I might have enjoyed every day. But when you add it all up, it was kind of just quotidian life, you know?
Well, I also feel like that might be a lot of Western culture that's just ingrained in us. You
It
know,
could
this
be.
idea that we wanna look back on our lives and see all of our accomplishments,
Yeah,
and
we wanna have a legacy. That's a
yeah, and
huge
that
part.
feels very Western to me,
For sure, for
and
sure.
and that makes me wonder where the line is between the act of creation and the completion of creation and achievement.
Mm,
And because one feels more pure and fulfilling than the other when putting it under a microscope next to each other like that, you know?
yeah, for sure. Oh gosh, now we're talking about purity in our fulfillment and happiness, oh no.
Well, because I mean, we are speaking about fulfillment on different levels, and if
Yeah.
we're talking about the ultimate good life, right? If I mean, because even as we're kind of defining this good life, we're talking about it as this thing that we are reaching for, this kind of high up goal, but is it one thing or is it a range? Are there variations of a good life even? Are there levels to what end are we fulfilled but not having a good life? You know, to what end do we have a good life but are not fulfilled? Is that making any sense?
It makes so much sense, it makes me confused.
Yeah, because also we also have to take into account you and I are in our early and mid 20s,
Yeah.
and
We're just
our
babies. We're gonna be so wise when we're older.
one can hope. Um, but to try to establish and seek a continuous good life it feels silly. Part of it just feels silly. Like, ultimately, it is important, and like you said, it's the big philosophical question, TM,
Mhm.
but
At the end of the
to
day, so what?
yeah, and that makes me that kind of drives me back towards your earlier thought of, well, to what level does the life have a positive influence on the community and those around it? Because on an individual and cosmic level, it certainly does not matter if we have a good life. It
Oh,
matters to
yeah.
us because it's the only thing we get to experience. So we're inclined to make it as enjoyable and fulfilling as possible, but there is only one way to have a lasting I don't even know if there is a way to have a lasting positive influence cosmically.
I mean, no, cosmically, I don't think it's possible. We just have to, hold our hands up and say everything is gonna end someday, we know that.
But is the pursuit of that what makes a life good?
As you were talking, I was thinking you're sounding a lot like an absurdist philosopher. You know,
Crazy.
crazy. Never would have expected that from you at all, out of left field. But that absurdist perspective does kind of take yeah, we can decide what creates a good life and do everything we want, but at the end of the day the whole universe is eventually going to implode on itself and maybe even re-explode again and create another big bang and start the whole process over. So what's the point? And I think we just have to decide for ourselves what the point is and cultivate that meaning and purpose for ourselves and use some guiding principles, whatever your conscience. We haven't even talked about the conscience yet.
Well, yeah, and, like, I think that mention of meaning is especially important because when we talk about having a good life, we want to have a meaningful life, right? We want it to have ultimately done something or had an effect or an impact or even just some overall theme or
Yeah.
moral or something to I don't even know, satisfy us? Sustain us? What I don't know,
We do like being satisfied and sustained here on Earth. I think
but
those are good guesses.
I mean, if you are satisfied and sustained for I mean, is it worth the pursuit of a good life to be satisfied and sustained in the moments before death? If you even have the moments to reflect before death, if it isn't sudden, if it's expected.
Mm,
So, is our cultivation of meaning more purposeful for how we engage in the daily life and the construction of a good life than the overall impact and effect to look back on?
honestly, I don't know. And if any of you listening have any ideas, pitch them to us. Throw it to us on Twitter. We're dying to have some answers here. Like,
Yes.
you see
How
where if you've made it this far, by the way, thank you so much for sticking with us, because I have felt like a complete constellate mess up here, because this is just such a big question, and I'm really curious what other people think about it.
It's one of the biggest questions, and yes, we would really like to know how you define a good life. And here in our next episode in a couple of weeks, we'll be discussing how we put this in practice. What does living a good life look like, and how does one attain it? Now that we've got not a close definition, but at least a workable definition and idea of what a good life looks like. So thank you for sticking with us.
We really appreciate it. We hope that we didn't scare you away and that you'll come back next time and join us again for a little more chaos, a little more non-answers, but it should be fun. Thanks for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to join the conversation, find us on Twitter and TikTok at BTB Philosophy. We would love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Visit our website at beyondthebarrelpod.buzzsprout.com for updated information and transcripts of each episode. Stay curious, stay open, and stay kind. We'll talk to you next time.